Welcome to this program in the Our Finger Lakes History series. I am Seneca County historian Walter Gable. This program deals with Watkins Glen State Park. This Watkins Glen State Park has significant history and just marvelously beautiful nature, waterfalls, and gorges. Both of these I will be dealing with in this program. There are many waterfalls in the Finger Lakes, but Watkins Glen is clearly the most famous of the gorges for tourists to walk through. Watkins Glen State Park is located in the village of Watkins Glen, near the very south end of Seneca Lake. It is the most famous of the Finger Lakes state parks. In 2015, it was chosen as the third most popular of the more than 6,000 state parks in the United States. The area that makes up Watkins Glen State Park was purchased by the state of New York in 1906. The park today consists of 778 acres, with its centerpiece being the 400-foot deep, narrow gorge cut through rock by Glen Creek. Watkins Glen, as you can see in this visual, the park has actually been an erosion-sculptured chasm. There are 19 waterfalls within the 2 miles length of the park, as the Glen's stream descends 400 feet past cliffs that are 200 feet tall. Of course, in addition to the Glen itself, there is a camping area. The gorge was created over the last approximately 12,000 years by Glen Creek eroding away the thin shale rock layers beneath the tougher sandstone layers above. This has created the several cascades and waterfalls within the park. The gorge is a staircase of waterfalls. Real staircases take you around these various falls and cascades. Beginning about 2 million years ago, there were different time periods when glaciers covered New York in thick ice. That ice layer was at least 1 mile thick. The most recent glacial period took place about 21,000 years ago. It was in this most recent glacial period that the landscape features we know today were created. About 12,000 years ago, Glen Creek began to flow into the deep trough of Seneca Lake, creating the gorge ever since then. In other words, 12,000 years ago, there was no gorge. Glen Creek flowed easily into Seneca Lake. In the last 12,000 years, however, erosion has been creating the gorge as we know it today. One of the main means of erosion is the thousands of floods that have swept down Glen Creek. These floods have swept away rocks that have fallen and scoured the various layers of soft stone on the gorge walls. Another type of erosion is that of the freezing of winter months. In winter, water freezes and fractures rocks on the walls of the gorge. These frost or freeze-loosened rocks eventually fall from the cliff walls, gradually widening the gorge. Over time, floods have washed the rocks out of the gorge and into the south end of Seneca Lake. Here you see the park gorge where visitors begin their walk through the gorge trail itself upstream. I visited there on June 30th of this year. This is the view of the beginning of the Gorge Trail, but looking east this time, in other words, downstream instead of west or upstream. As you start out on the Gorge Trail, the first bridge that you can see as you walk is this one. Just upstream from this bridge is the first waterfalls or cascade that you can enjoy seeing. Note in these visuals the clear evidence of stream erosion of the several layers of soft rock that has created in the last 12,000 years the gorge as we know it today. This is the waterfalls which you can easily walk behind. This is that same waterfalls just as I was walking nearby, nearly behind that waterfalls. I like this picture. It's the picture I took looking through the waterfalls itself. I took this picture of that same waterfalls as I was coming back down the Gorge Trail. I was inside the cave staircase when I took this picture, so there's lots of black background in this picture. Now to talk about some of the human history associated with Watkins Glen. As you can see in this visual, the area was occupied by Seneca Indians until after the American Revolutionary War. As this park sign suggests, the Seneca Indians were part of the Iroquois Confederacy, and they carried on growing of crops such as corn and pumpkins and squash, as well as having fruit orchards. After the Revolutionary War, we had European Americans or whites moving into this area. These white settlers soon made use of the water power that the stream provided to operate various mills. The gorge itself wasn't suitable for farming, but it was suitable to harness the water power. In 1794, the Watkins family purchased the land and erected mills that harnessed the powerful Glen Creek waters. In 1828, Samuel Watkins dammed the upper gorge and constructed new mills at the base of the gorge. In 1830, his flour mill was built and was located at the entrance today to the gorge. In 1842, he established the settlement of Jefferson because people were coming to get their grain ground at this mill. His settlement of Jefferson was later renamed Watkins Glen in his honor. This is a model of Samuel Watkins' flour mill as it probably looked in the 1830s. Water from the Glen Creek flowed into an elevated channel called the flume. You can see it just to the right of the model. The water then fell just beyond the top of the water wheel inside, turning the water wheel clockwise to generate the power needed to grind grain into flour. Thousands of pounds of grain could be ground in this flour mill each workday. Shown here is a picture of Morveldon Els, who is known as the father of the Glen. Els saw the great potential of the gorge as a tourist destination. His tireless promotions and many site improvements as manager made his vision a reality when his so-called Book of Nature opened to the public as a private enterprise on July 4th, 1863. Nearly 10,000 visitors came during the opening year season. Watkins Glen was a scenic tourist attraction at a time when many people of that Victorian age were fascinated by nature. By 1866, resort attendance had soared to about 23,000 visitors annually. Proprietors were adding various lodging and dining facilities. Expansion within the gorge itself opened up new areas of the gorge, allowing the people to enjoy more beautiful views, complemented with picturesque bridges, stairs, and pathways. Shown here is the Suspension Bridge, which was a lively center of resort activity in the late 1800s. James Hope operated an art gallery on the North Cliff, shown at left. The Glen Mountain House stood stately on the southern cliff of the gorge. Tourists had to navigate the gorge at their own risk. Shown here is an original wooden staircase that straddled Pluto Falls. This is a scan of a postcard showing Minnehaha Falls in 1906. You will note that there is a metal staircase and a bridge over the falls, but clearly it would not meet current safety standards. In this circa 1900 picture, you can see tourists at that time up close to one of the cascades within the glen. You will note in the left part of the picture that the gorge path at that time was rather unsafe. There was no low wall or railing. Next in this, you see a view of the park entrance along Franklin Street about 1920. This all came because by the early 1900s, public parks began to replace private resorts, and there were two major reasons for this. One reason is that there was a greater realization of the value of preserving the nation's natural treasures. It was considered that if they were owned by the government, be it national or state or even local government, it was believed that government ownership would mean preservation of national natural treasures. A second reason that as automobiles became more widespread, more of the public had easier access to recreational areas like Watkins Glen. The state of New York purchased Watkins Glen in November 1906. As a state park, in the next few decades, improvements were made, such as this visitor entrance. These two postcard scans show how beautiful improvements were made to the park entrance area. Notice the beautiful garden and the fountain. This park sign shows how the state of New York improved the beginnings of the Gorge Trail so that it was both safer and more enjoyable for park visitors. In these two visuals, you see how the state of New York made vitally important safety improvements. That postcard at left shows a somewhat unsafe staircase and walking bridge at Minnehaha Falls in 1906. The postcard at right, however, you see a much more secure and permanent concrete staircase with good metal railings at another part of the park. The park was enjoyed, but natural disasters do happen. On July 7, 1935, Watkins Glen, like the entire southern Finger Lakes region, suffered in the so-called flood of the century. 11 inches of rain fell in a 48-hour time period. It was estimated that creek waters on July 7th rose to just 5 feet below the suspension bridge, an upward surge of water 80 feet high. Raging water full of debris swept through the glen, ravaging trail structures and forever changing the contour of the gorge. The picture at right shows how the raging waters swept away walkway railings. The picture at bottom left shows how uprooted tree trunks piled up against the stone arch at the park entrance. Let's take a closer look at that last. Here you see uprooted trees that were piled high behind the entrance gateway. The flood utterly transformed the landscape of the gorge. A picturesque fountain and flower bed once stood on the site shown in this visual, but they were destroyed by the floodwaters July 7, 1935. But it wasn't just the glen. Floodwaters charged out of the park and swept through the village of Watkins Glen itself. The July 1935 flood of the century left the park devastated. There was much cleanup and rebuilding that had to be done before the park could be reopened to visitors. Interestingly, much of that work was done by a crew of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, which had arrived at the park just 2 days before the Great Flood, coincidentally. The Civilian Conservation Corps was a public relief program that was part of the FDR's New Deal. Remember, this is during the Depression. The park was closed for the entire rest of 1935 as CCC crew labored to do cleanup and repair the extensive damage. In the picture at left, you see some of the flood damage. In the picture at right, you see some CCC stonework that was installed. This naturalistic stonework remains today as the perfect complement to gorge scenery. This is a picture of CCC Unit SP-44 work crew that set up camp in White's Hollow just upstream from the gorge. They spent 6 years rebuilding the park after the devastating flood. This is another picture of the CCC work crew during restoration work in the gorge. The cleanup and restoration work was completed, the park reopened, and it's been a big visitor attraction since then. I want to end this segment about Watkins Glen State Park by showing some more pictures of the natural beauty of the glen that we can enjoy today, thanks to the restoration work that was done after the Great Flood of 1933. This is a commonly purchased postcard by visitors to Watkins Glen State Park. Attendance at Watkins Glen State Park in 2018 totaled an estimated 973,972 visitors, almost 1 million. I hope that you have enjoyed this segment of our Finger Lakes history.